Thank you so much for including me today. Among the great privileges of my position is that I get wonderful invitations like this one to talk directly to nonprofit leaders and staff like so many of you who are on the call. Most important, I get to hear directly from you who are out there every day doing everything you can to improve life in our community. I know there's a tight agenda for this session. We had a lot that we wanted to cover, but I do hope that we will make time to hear from you about the calls to action that drive you to pursue social change and make long-term changes in the quality of life in our community. As Fred said, never more desperately needed than now. We cannot ignore the sense of urgency and crisis that we are all feeling now. I imagine that the definition you have used in measuring the success of your missions is different on this first day of June than it was several months ago, when the biggest public health and economic crisis in a century descended on us, and now will be different than it was a week ago, before the horrific event in Minneapolis, which has catalyzed protest in every state in the country. What resonates for me and for many of you, I am sure, are Dr. Martin Luther King's words: "A riot is the language of the unheard." Frankly, both the international crisis of the pandemic and the national crisis around lack of justice and racism have helped to blow away the assumption that improving life conditions means that everyone benefits across our region. With a confirmed COVID-19 death toll surpassing 100,000, this epidemic has laid bare the shocking disproportion of minorities in the totals for many cities. In the economic crisis, Black and Brown America has been much harder hit than white America. And that prompts uncomfortable questions for me as someone responsible for measuring our foundation's effectiveness in improving quality of life in the region, especially for minorities and the most vulnerable. I hope to get into this more in a few minutes, but to ground us, I want to talk about the relationship between the Forbes Funds and the Pittsburgh Foundation. The Forbes Funds has been an integral part of our foundation's work in the community for nearly 40 years. Originally begun as an assistance center for nonprofits who are experiencing financial problems, the organization's mission has broadened as a supporting organization of our foundation. It's now very proactive in identifying opportunities and challenges for the nonprofit sector and in developing strategies that will help organizations such as yours gain better capacity, expertise, and resilience. And GPNP has been indispensable in that work, especially on the policy front. I can't think of another area in the COVID-produced economic crisis that is more important to the future of the sector. The supporting organization label is a little strange and confusing to some people, but what it means is that the Forbes Funds and by extension GPNP are key strategic partners. The Pittsburgh Foundation's mission is advanced significantly through their efforts. That's why we support Forbes annually, a $400,000 grant this year, for example, to support the ground level work. And there's more funding for major convenings. Other local foundations see value added for their grantees and provide support. I understand that there are people on this call from across a 10-county region, which is amazing. All of you coming together through GPNP to learn and collaborate is critically important if Southwestern Pennsylvania is going to emerge better on the other side of this public health emergency, economic crisis, and social crisis. What I've heard so far from other nonprofit leaders is that many of you are working overtime to deliver on your mission. And you also face the challenge of supporting staff members who are experiencing extraordinary stress at work and in their personal lives. I want to get your sense of those challenges and others that you may be facing. But before that, I'm going to run quickly through what our foundation has been doing throughout the crisis period and the very beginning of our thinking about what we need to concentrate on for at least the rest of the year. First, a little bit about my time in Pittsburgh so far. Today actually marks my first-year anniversary leading the Pittsburgh Foundation. Like many of you, I was working on exciting plans in the first 3 months of this year. We were celebrating the foundation's 75th anniversary. I was listening and learning in dozens of interactions like this session. I was getting ready to lead the staff and board in developing a new strategic plan. Then the world, and I do mean the entire world, turned upside down. The coronavirus hit and we went into emergency response mode. As a community foundation, our role in a crisis is to be the region's philanthropic first responders. In the week before St. Patrick's Day, we shifted from being an intensely interactive operation with dozens of in-person meetings and large group convenings to a virtual one. Despite all the unknowns swirling around us, we decided on a single mission, establishing an emergency action fund to raise as much money as possible to be granted as fast as possible. When we announced the fund on March 16th, we had commitments of $1 million each from our foundation, the Heinz Endowments, the Henry L. Hillman Foundation, and the Richard King Mellon Foundation. Beyond that, as of Friday, we have raised about $9 million, including the $1.5 million from our donors and the public, and $3.5 million from corporations and other foundations. The participation has been impressive, heartwarming, and inspiring. As of today, just 11 weeks since the Action Fund's launch, we've awarded $9 million in grants. Before we raised the first dollar, we knew that dire needs would outpace resources, so our staff spent time checking in with your sector to determine funding priorities. We relied upon the COVID needs survey results from the United Way of Southwest Pennsylvania. Our program staff undertook its own exhaustive check-in, phone interviews, and online focus groups with more than 100 nonprofits in all sectors, from healthcare and human services, education, and the arts. The finding of those conversations formed the basis of the criteria for our Action Fund grants, which were announced the first week of May. The first wave provided support to get government, public health, and human service systems to the front line to make sure they had what they needed to meet the then enormous, overwhelming seeming challenges. With 12 grants totaling $3.3 million, we provided funding to provide temporary housing and food distribution to groups that are unable to self-quarantine, provided staffing and medical support for the Allegheny County Health Department, and supported doubling the United Way's 211 call-in capacity, which as of last week had received 35,000 calls for help. Grants also supported the United Way's regional food distribution system and 6 community-based health centers across Westmoreland and Allegheny. And we awarded $300,000 to an emergency child care fund organized by Trying Together, the child care advocacy organization. The other side of the Action Fund provided 300 grants ranging from $5,000 to $25,000, a total of just over $5 million, with a majority of them going to organizations with budgets under $5 million. These grants benefit organizations in Allegheny, Beaver, and Westmoreland counties, serving predominantly low-income households, including nonprofits serving individuals impacted by COVID-19, to community health facilities, and to small arts organizations that have not been able to perform, produce, or exhibit. I reviewed each of the recommended grants and also those that we had to decline because of the demand, and my overall impression is that we are so fortunate as a community to have nonprofit leaders who know how to shift and innovate in an emergency. About 30% of our grantees have pivoted to or dramatically increased their focus on food insecurity. An example that we're reporting on in the next issue of our quarterly publication is Kitchen of Grace on the North Side, which switched from providing job training skills to preparing meals for low-income people and seniors. And like Bonafide Bellevue, which transitioned from offering a farmer's market to providing food delivery and meal prep to low-income families and seniors in a community where no food pantry or delivery service existed before. And now I'd like to go back to the information I reported before about the virus's disproportionate toll on people of color. Our Action Fund guidelines state that, quote, "We recognize that the economic crisis caused by the pandemic will disproportionately affect those living in poverty, people of color, people with disabilities, communities that are socially isolated, immigrants and refugees, and those workers who provide essential services, but who are paid far below a living wage. A guiding principle for our coordination is racial equity. Achieving racial equity would mean that one's racial identity would no longer predict how one fares in society." More than 25% of Action Fund grants are to nonprofits led by Black and Brown people. You all helped us arrive at this approach. If I had one takeaway for you regarding this process, it is that the input from nonprofits is invaluable. You asked us for a simplified application and for operating support so you could adjust your operations to meet the greatest needs. We heard you, and that's what we've done with this fund. So the emergency response is happening, and the big question for us at the foundation is now what? In terms of system support, we know that if we're going to be successful in restarting our regional economy, providing employment, and providing health and safety for all of our residents, then more testing is needed. In our conversations with public health and human services leaders, we're hearing that the biggest concerns are about making sure we're testing enough, which we're not. And of course, contact tracing is a huge area of need. Data sharing across the state and the region is not good enough yet, and there are issues about capturing such important demographic information as race. We also know that summer out-of-school programs, which often fill the childcare gap for working families, is really in jeopardy. The foundation community is now turning its attention to larger, longer-term economic recovery issues. Our board's meeting next week, and we'll be discussing what priorities to set in helping our region gain back its footing, to recover, and to build more resistance. Of paramount importance to us all today is the foundation community's record in dealing with systemic racism and the unjust treatment of many minorities that pervades our society. We're reeling from the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis last week, and of Ahmaud Arbery in February and Breonna Taylor in March. And while the demonstrations and violence in Pittsburgh last weekend were spurred by George Floyd's death, the memories of similar race-based injustice here are fresh, from Antoine Rose 2 years ago to Johnny Gamage in 1995. The tragedy is that there is a list for nearly every city in this country. In 2015, I was leading a nonprofit in Baltimore when Freddie Gray was killed and when residents of that city took to the area around our offices to demonstrate their anger and grief. As we think about what our funding priorities will include, we know that racial equity is critically important to improving quality of life for everyone in the region. On more practical terms, I can tell you that we at the foundation remain committed to including the nonprofit community in the priorities we set for our advocacy and policy change efforts during the recovery. We're also committed to easing reporting requirements on grants and continuing to provide operating funds. And we are continuing programs that we know can help you directly during this recovery period. Our critical needs alert was moved from May 19th to August 19th and will be focused on raising operating dollars for nonprofits providing basic needs. You can go to pittsburghgives.org and update your profiles if you haven't already done so. We're living through a series of flashpoints that make it clear that no one set of actions can address this moment. Enacting change, as we know from history, is messy business, and we must persist over the long term. But as a community foundation, we have the responsibility to recommit ourselves and every resource we have, our relationships, our networks, our assets, and our ability to advocate, to do as much as we can for the sake of future generations. And we have the responsibility to ask you, what can we do that will make a difference? Where is help most urgently needed? My responsibility is to make sure that the Pittsburgh Foundation advances in its mission to improve quality of life for all of us. From the perspective of your experience and your organization's work, I'd like to know what should be on our list to achieve that. We will work together to form strategies collectively. And I'll turn this back over to Fred and Olivia, and hopefully we'll be able to take some questions from you. Thank you all for your participation in GPNP and for taking time to attend this session this morning.
Thank you, Lisa. And with that, I will turn it over to Hannah Lowcock to lead us in questions.
First, thank you so much, Lisa, for addressing our group and being here and really connecting our current events and our current situation this time for everyone with the really important work of the Pittsburgh Foundation and our philanthropic family, as Fred said earlier. I see some questions coming in. I'm going to leave some more time for folks to form their questions, really put some well-worded ones in the chat. And I also want to open up the opportunity as well. If folks feel compelled to speak, I would ask that you click the raise hand button and we will keep monitoring that and so give you that opportunity as it allows. I want to open up with a question. I really appreciated you touching on the impact that the Emergency Action Fund is making and the $9 million that was allocated in grants. And I'm wondering, in terms of being philanthropic first responders, as you said, what are some other ways in which nonprofits can engage in the Pittsburgh Foundation's work that are beyond grant making?
Yes, great question. And particularly for this group, we, as thrilled as we are at the generosity that has poured out in terms of donations to the Emergency Action Fund, the truth is that all of the philanthropy in our region is just a drop in the bucket relative to the needs that are really raining down on our community. So our next step is to work with you on advocacy and working to connect nonprofits to the resources that all nonprofits deserve. And I'm very happy to say that as of Friday, there is a commitment at the state level for $2.3 billion of CARES Act funding in many categories that relate to basic needs and the provision of services for the most vulnerable. So it's our job, we believe, they will all be administered through distinct municipalities or authorities. And we think it's our job to help you get there, to figure out how is this money going to flow? How do people qualify? How do you find your way in to make formal proposals? We can, this is a unique opportunity. There also is, the state is still allocated an additional over $1 billion of CARES Act funding that has not been appropriated yet. So we stand committed to figure out how to make sure that there's access to all through those funds. Now, I will just say that we all know that this is complex and has the record of success thus far is up and down. One of the things that we've been working on with many leaders, including I'm sure many of you on the phone, is the lack of access to Black-owned businesses to to PPP and Small Business Association money. So we've been working with banks and local advocates to figure out there still is a lot of PPP money to be issued. So we'll be looking as well as where can we find resources, where are people not finding resources. So that's where that's what's so critical about staying in touch with you and having you let us know how is it going out there.
Thank you for that, Lisa. It's great that you started actually touching on some topics that folks are starting to ask in the chat. And I want to refer to some in the chat right now. So in terms of folks who may have already applied to the Emergency Action Fund, are there continued to be decisions made on whether organizations will continue to be able to access those?
So the Emergency Action Fund is our last round of grants is under consideration now. The fund is on pause, and the reason for that is that we really our donors have, we believe, done as much as they can, especially now that businesses are in trouble themselves. So we know we need to pivot. We will of course continue our own grant making, our own grant making through the foundation. So please stay posted and involved about that. We also, one of the reasons we think that it's time to pivot to public support is that we're concerned that the private support is that we've really tapped the ability of private sector to make donations, at least to this particular fund. We also have a partnership that has been guiding the allocation of the public health resources that includes the 4 foundations that I mentioned: the United Way of Southwest Pennsylvania, the Allegheny County Departments of Health and Human Services. Together, we look at the list of, one of the heartbreaking things is that we had at least twice as many requests as we have available funding. So what we've been doing is sharing the list of requests to make sure that we can spread philanthropy as broadly as possible. Our staff has also been working with donors, some of whom have been really compelled to do grant making for organizations that need the help. So I think the short answer is in all ways. I think the long answer is that we're shifting to broader advocacy to bring resources in while we continue to do the level of grant making that we can.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that kind of insight. And then you also mentioned a little bit about minority-owned businesses and trying to coordinate some work around that. And so as that keeps going, and you've created an open invitation here for folks to kind of express that, how can folks stay involved in that kind of work and continue to uplift minority-owned businesses during this time in partnership with
So give us your feedback. Here is what seems to be rising to the top, is the need for a range of professional assistance in order to create compelling proposals. Accounting, law, banking, there are a host actually of resources being offered in terms of assistance. What we're thinking is that there seems to be a lack of the ability for nonprofits to connect to those resources. So we're looking at, is there a need for a sort of a 2-1-1 kind of service and matching people, or because for instance, both Duquesne University and CMU's Center for Entrepreneurial Excellence have great resources. There are also lots of private professionals who are well experienced to offer assistance. I think if you tell us what the frustrations that you're having are, what resources you're finding your way to, what resources you're not, then that helps us to figure out how to fill the gaps, and work with banks to make sure that there's appropriate awareness of pent-up need in the pipeline.
Definitely appreciate that as well. And as a connecting question, and then I'd be happy to move on to some other questions that are coming in. Thinking sector-wide, how might nonprofits collaborate with businesses to play a role in keeping our communities here in Pittsburgh thriving?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that I think we should have open forums, and town hall style conversations, including businesses, which we often don't do enough. What has been really inspiring in relative to the pandemic has been to see businesses step in and pivot in their functions in order to manufacture equipment or distribute and purchase equipment. So it's really important to hang on to that collaboration and keep going. But I do think we have to do much better about that. And I appreciate the question as a challenge moving forward.
And now I want to give an opportunity for folks in the conversation to jump in. And I see that Rebecca Gilmer has a great question. I'd like to give her the opportunity to unmute herself and voice that now.
Lisa, I'm very grateful for your work. Bethany Community Ministries Homewood has been our work has been greatly enhanced because of the support of the Pittsburgh Foundation. We think highly of you all. And the little I know of you, I believe you are a woman who says, who means what you say. And I don't always have that same sense when I talk to folks who have achieved the level of stature that you have in your profession. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful that you're working so closely with the Forbes Funds and the way that the Forbes Funds stays very connected to the community. Yeah. That matters. There's a credibility that the Forbes Funds enjoys because of that. And I know they're pressing to do more. As we face the reality of what life is for Black folks in this country as manifested by the murder of George Floyd. I know in another context, you describe those challenges as labyrinthian, and I think that's a good term, complex. And you also talked about seizing the day in the quest for justice, and that this justice has got to persist over a long term. And I believe you when you talk about leveraging relationships and networks and advocacy so that something can be done. I would like in this moment if you would comment to us what you believe, what you anticipate may happen when you regard the work of the Pittsburgh Foundation. Now, I realize this is an early question for you, but I know that you've been doing the work to be able to formulate some good reflections. So without holding you to it, but also wanting to know your thinking in those terms, what do you think the Pittsburgh Foundation can do in this moment that will make a difference?
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I love your question about what we can do, because I think that we are all floored right now about the repeating cycles of history, and the feeling that how can we be here 50 years after Dr. King's speech of 1967. I mean, we know that we have proved to ourselves that these critical issues are not only not going away, they are so persistent that they present the challenge to our society. And I will say very carefully and as honestly as I can, I am listening, thinking, talking, asking, because I think the question is, what is it that we can do this time that will make a difference? And we need to be pondering many, many strategies of what to do in order to make change that must be very long term. I'm also obviously thinking very hard about my own position as a white woman of privilege. Consequently, I know that there is a great deal that I must continue to learn and continue to probe in order to be as effective a leader and coordinate the attributes, the assets, the resources, the networks, the relationships that all of us have in order to make true change. I'm not naive about this. I'm a native of Baltimore, and I lived in West Baltimore and worked in West Baltimore when Freddie Gray died and the riots in Baltimore actually began on the property of the Parks and People Foundation, where I was. And as is well known, the history of violence in Baltimore is just deeply, deeply troubling. That's when I said to our staff team this morning that I know that it's a labyrinthian challenge. I mean that, but we cannot afford to let that stymie us. We cannot afford not to take advantage of this particular flashpoint as a means of learning and moving forward. I do think that it would be hasty, if not irresponsible, for me to put forward specific strategies right now, because I think we all need to listen very carefully to what the world is telling us. But I can tell you that that's what we will be doing at the Pittsburgh Foundation, and we'll be thinking hard about how to contribute every resource we have, including a remarkable, remarkable staff that is very involved through countless grantee organizations and policy and advocacy research. We'll keep going and keep talking with all of you. I believe this is the issue of our times. It has always been the issue of our time, but we have an opportunity to listen to the stark events in every single state in this country, and take strength from that this needs to be the strongest and most long-range area of focus and action for us all.
And I want you to listen, and I want you to be careful. I want all those things, but I'm also looking to hear how long you think that might take as things are happening in this present moment. And as I believe, because of all the experience you've had before, there's something that's maybe taking shape in you that perhaps only the Pittsburgh Foundation can do as far as leading the way. So I'm not asking for a definite answer in this moment, but I am asking that something come our way, that we know at some point.
Well, and you know, that's a great point. And what a community foundation can do that other foundations cannot is advocate. And we have already retained professional consultation to figure out how to learn and understand as much of the legislative landscape as we possibly can, which is the basis for figuring out where we can make change. And last week, for instance, where we could make change was advocating for CARES Act funding. So please don't think that we'll be sitting around. But I envision that 200 different strategies will emerge, and some of them will be able to take on right away, and some of them will require long-term, very, very thoughtful action. Systemic change is a long-term process, but and let me just say too that just to our staff, every single corner of our organization was involved in the Emergency Action Fund. And we took on that project at the same time that we moved off-site and had to move all of our technological systems off-site. And people had children on their laps and children that needed to be needed to do online schooling, and many have elders that they're caring for. And it's just amazing to me how quickly we were able to pull resources together. And I have no doubt that that same ethic and ethos will be at play moving forward. It's my greatest honor and my greatest responsibility to be the leader of this extraordinary organization.
Thank you both, Rebecca and Lisa, and definitely want to give a shout out and a thank you to our colleagues at the Pittsburgh Foundation for continuing to work with us and community partners on continuing to uplift everyone in our region. And what's great about this call is that it's a call for community solutions, and solutions and ideas are just rolling into the chat. And I want to tee up one by Jason Flowers, who is going to speak on a 211 type service for small businesses. So Jason, as you feel ready, please feel free to unmute.
Okay, I was already unmuted, but yeah, you mentioned the 211 type service for small businesses. You know, we're a small business accelerator, and we're working with we're part of a network called the E3 network. It was set up by Forward Cities and is being led by the Riverside Center for Innovation. And we have several entrepreneurial support organizations that are on the forefront of making sure all of these small minority businesses are successful. And we have, they're called navigators on the ground, getting all the information that's needed from these small businesses. And they are forwarding them to these entrepreneurial support networks on every stage. One of the things that I'm seeing and I'm realizing that, you know, these navigators that are sending these small businesses, they probably have 100 businesses that they're working with each, and it seems like the need is going to grow. So you know, there's definitely a need for support for these entrepreneurial support organizations, because we're getting a lot of need from small businesses, especially minority small businesses going through this time of COVID.
Thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate it. And I want to give just a heads up for folks that we'll leave around 5 more minutes for Q&A. I love the conversation we've been having today, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can or connect them as well. And I definitely want to link together the policy and advocacy work that Lisa teed up earlier, and really the critical role that nonprofits play, especially in working with and mobilizing underserved communities who are the most impacted by policies and COVID and racial injustice right now. And there are questions in the chat that are, asking what are some of the policy priorities that the Pittsburgh Foundation sees as being really critical at this time. And folks are asking about, childcare and a living wage for workers around this region. So Lisa, if you might want to speak to that.
Yes, and yes, thank you. And let me also just ask for some information from all of you, and then I'll get right to the heart of the question. One of the things that we are doing in Harrisburg is putting a face on a statistical face on the service and the value that the nonprofit sector provides in order to demonstrate as powerfully as possible to legislators that without this sector, we are going to be in really big trouble in terms of being able to provide public services across the board. And while we have, we have deep references and data around the scope and scale of the need, we're still looking for statistics about what percentage of services nonprofits actually fill out there. So I'll just ask you that if you've been doing that kind of work and would share it with us, it will help us make the strongest case possible for allocation of public stimulus money. We have the Pittsburgh Foundation has for some time been focused on four different areas of policy, and we're now broadening beyond that. But looking at the perils of eviction and working in particularly around what will happen if and when the moratorium around evictions are suspended, working on food insecurity, and I'm imagining that a number of you on the phone participated in the webinar that the Pittsburgh Foundation and Just Harvest hosted a couple of weeks ago, and that has resulted in some progress both several months ago and just recently in terms of policy change. We are deeply focused right now on childcare, and which has been an area of focus for the Pittsburgh Foundation for a very long time. But of course, the issues of childcare are thrown into a state of urgency by all of the circumstances that surround us. Please do go to our website to review policy statements, including statements about social justice. Obviously, this needs to be we need to take a here and now view of policy around social justice as a major focus going forward. We of course also are looking at housing and safety from violence, the challenges faced by single women raising children, and workforce training, and also the simple ability for people in this region to reach jobs, which is particularly challenging given our lack of transit and the geography that makes transportation so challenging. And I would just say in an overarching sense, we're seeing that the growth of vulnerability and need extending from the city out into rural counties, 10 counties. And we know that we need to be looking at solutions that are as resonant and effective for rural populations as urban populations. And the need is uniform, even as the structure of communities is often very different.
Thank you, Lisa, for enumerating those. I think that's really helpful for us here in the chat, here in the group, And going off of policy and advocacy, I want to remind folks that tomorrow is our Pennsylvania state primary. If you're voting by mail, you can drop off, here in Allegheny County at least, you can drop off your ballot at the elections office, or follow safety guidelines for voting in person if that is something you are choosing to do. And considering we only have a little bit of time left, we're going to have one more question. And I want to connect back to the operating funds and what you mentioned earlier, Lisa, about the critical needs alert being moved to August of this year. If it's possible, it'd be great if you could elaborate on the critical needs alert and what might there be other plans for supporting nonprofits and their operating funds this year.
Yeah, sure. So critical needs alert is a tradition, if you will, at the Pittsburgh Foundation of identifying areas of obviously great need, and our donors providing special funding to incent grant making, and the foundation contributes as well. So it's an opportunity to provide funding in a very fluid way to meet things that are right on the top of people's lists in terms of levels of urgency. So you can definitely find the critical needs alert on our website. I will say that one of the reasons that we postponed the critical needs alert is because we knew that we're all in this for the long haul, and we knew that months down the line there would be as much if not more need than we were addressing through the Emergency Action Fund. So this too is it's a special capability that a community foundation can provide, because we are about promoting legacies of philanthropy. And fortunately, we have hundreds and hundreds of donors who really care about how they can make a difference in the community. So that's it's a very concentrated, one-time, albeit regularly scheduled each year, one-time opportunity for us to get resources that wouldn't ordinarily find their way into the community, to the places that need them most.